We ended the last segment talking about Alvin Langdon Coburn and his pictorialist strategy. We'll start this segment with this photographic portrait by Edward Steichen of John Pierpont Morgan, who was a financier and one of the wealthiest men in the world. So Steichen, who's part of Stieglitz's photosecession group, if you remember, Steichen and Stieglitz started to have difficulty agreeing with one another, and Stieglitz wanted Steichen to remain pure of any commercial taint. But Steichen started to work commercially, and that eventually caused a rift between the two. So here is Steichen making a dramatically symbolic portrait of one of the most powerful men in the world. And he's making it symbolic by what he includes and what he excludes. It's very intentional. Firstly, look at his expression, which has this kind of really intense look of disdain or power or influence, with flashing eyes that look sort of determined and very much in control. But it's fascinating what he chooses to emphasize and also what he chooses to de-emphasize. And looking at this composition, you can see how Steichen has isolated several things in what is otherwise a very dark background. Very minimalist kind of scene. The intensely stern face, the pocket watch, and the firm grip on the hand, which looks like a hand holding a knife. These things really stand out, and they become really important elements in conveying who this man is. So this image is very symbolic. It's not just a straightforward portrait, but it's a portrait made to convey symbolically who this person is and what they represent. And it's really interesting that here photography is beginning to take over some of the things that the painting world had done. So there was a group of painters working at about the same time that began to use color in their images, and they used color in a way that was non-representational. They used color because it functioned well in the picture, a direct, non-descriptive way of using color, and they became known as the fauves, and fauve in French means wild thing or creature. In 1905, fauve painter André Durand wrote to a friend of his and said, "This drastic use of color is a reaction to photography and its influence on painting. It is the era of photography. This influences us and plays a part in our reaction against anything that resembles a snapshot of life." So the painting world is saying that they don't want to make anything like a photograph. They're interested in making the opposite of this, something that is completely different, that uses color in a very specific way, and that reacts against photography. Here's a perfect example of a fauve painting. This painting is by Henri Matisse. It's a portrait of Madame Matisse, made in 1905. And in this portrait of his wife, Matisse has used color in a way that painters had not looked at color before. He's paying attention to not just the face, but how the face interacts with its background. Look at the color relationships and the complementary pairings of color here, and how this plays off of the idea of the foreground color versus the background color. The background here is split into areas of color. We're looking at green, purple, and orange kind of colors. He's painted the face not as a rounded object, but rather by different shapes that change in terms of color, not value. And he's playing with that whole sense of how we perceive color. So it's important to remember that early photography was insistently black and white, unless it had color added to it. And this inspired the fauves to liberate color with a new strategy, and they began to think about creating imagery in a different way. Earlier, we looked at the idea of abstraction in photography. As the camera edits the world, it draws a frame which both includes and excludes specific elements based on the photographer's decision. This image by Stieglitz in 1907 opened a new kind of dialogue about how photographs functioned in the art world. Stieglitz talked about this image on a purely formal level, defining the contrast, value, and compositional arrangement. But he titled it the steerage, which is the deck where the lower class people rode versus the upper class deck where the wealthier people rode. So the photograph is generally pointed to as being a big milestone in photography because it was the first photograph that had a real social message. And when he talked about it, Stieglitz downplayed this have versus have-not message, and instead he played up the formal qualities of the image. Stieglitz said that what influenced him to make the image were the strong shapes, the lines, the tones, and the composition, and he talked about it in terms of form, but he was pointing at how photography frames the world. So it's in this sense of abstraction that this photograph is interesting, and how these aesthetic elements in a photograph were recognized metaphorically in a similar way as paintings were, and they were largely abstracted as compared to what had gone before. So here is Pablo Picasso in 1907, and Picasso is interested in a new perception as well. And what he comes up with is the idea that the world could be abstracted in a way that was not the way we perceive it, or had been, or had ever been. One thing he explored was how to look at his subject from many perspectives simultaneously, both from the front and from the back and from the side, and why should it be necessary to glue oneself to a specific spot. It's also important to point out that these pictures began to get large. So here is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon at the MoMA in New York City. It's 96 inches by 92 inches, much larger than most photographs that you would see. So where does Picasso come up with this idea that someone could see something from multiple points of view at the same time? Well, guess what? Edward Muybridge had been doing this for a while, and he ended up making something called the Encyclopedia of Human and Animal Locomotion, which was a giant collection of thousands upon thousands of photographs of humans and animals in every possible state of motion. So he came up with this set of devices that allowed him to do this from multiple perspectives. He could set up 3 or 4 cameras to make images at the same point in time that allowed him to accomplish this strategy. So Picasso picks up on that and calls it simultaneity of vision, that looking at one thing from multiple points of view is really interesting. A commonly used example of this is Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase. Duchamp didn't want to be confined to a body walking by or painting the body from one particular spot. He began to look at the legs and physical body as forms. And also here's Edward Muybridge's counterpart, Etienne Marey, who created a series in Europe called Human Locomotion. So then Duchamp stretched it out even further and made this other piece called Nude Descending a Staircase No. 2, which obviously abstracted it substantially even more. So what we have now is this world where through photography, the world can be seen, in this case, from multiple points of view that might make the way that we see more relevant. Photography has influenced this vision by examining the way that we see. So Picasso gave the idea that if painting wanted to move forward, that it should abandon trying to tell a story, because he felt that photography was all about trying to tell a story. So I'm going to move forward again. Here's Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother, very famous photograph, iconic image. Remember the FSA, the Farm Security Administration that we have talked about, trying to reveal the plight and dilemma of rural farmers in the United States. They wanted to tell people across the country this particular story to depict poor people working in fields across the United States. So Dorothea Lange made this image in 1936, and most people have seen this image before because it's widely distributed. It represents something in time. The reason for this is the incredible power of the image to become a symbol for the Farm Security Administration. We see this face of this woman fraught with worry and fear, and we wonder, how is she going to provide for her family? This is a very poignant picture and a very dramatically and powerfully symbolic photograph. It's about this woman, but it's really about all women and all families in this time period in the United States, with this kind of unbelievable symbolic power that photography is wielding in the 1930s and in the 1940s. Here's a painting by Chicago painter Ivan Albright. He started this image in 1941 and he finished it in 1943. It's called Poor Room, There is No Time, No End, No Today, No Yesterday, No Tomorrow, Only the Forever and Forever and Forever Without End. So he started in 1941, and here it's an unfinished painting. Here it is a finished painting in this image, and it shows the horrible disintegration of a man and his environment. Out of his imagination, Ivan Albright has created a cluttered and dilapidated house that we see through this open window, filled with the cast-off wreckage of a person's life. Bits and pieces of things, the stuff we gather around us in our lives. The picture becomes a study of despair and of agony, which is similar to Dorothea Lange's study of despair and agony as well. In America, the 1950s brought tremendous prosperity, and Swiss-born photographer Robert Frank was given a Guggenheim Fellowship grant in 1954 to travel across the United States and capture the essence of the United States in photographs. What he found was the mundane and often drab aspects of American life in the 1950s. Here in this photograph, which is called Restaurant US 1, Leaving Columbia, South Carolina, made in 1955, the photograph shows us this empty cafe with TV evangelist Oral Roberts preaching his message to no one. There's this dramatically overexposed window, which symbolically reminds us that we're in the middle of an era of Cold War in the 1950s. Also in the 1950s, we begin to get images like this from Jackson Pollock. So here's Pollock, and a lot of you may know who he is, but these images are huge. You can see him painting this image, which is really quite enormous. In these enormous giant paintings, what Pollock did was finally take painting away from the easel and painting a picture of a thing. He took enormous canvases and used his body and dealt with the physical quality of the paint on the canvas surface. So this image is completely devoid of subject. These are very physical objects, and this is something he called action painting. So this is the last bastion of painting, separating it from its subject completely. These are paintings about interaction of color, shape, and form. So in the 1980s, something else began happening. Here's Olivia Parker, who has been active from the 1980s until today, and she began to go backward and explore still life imagery. She began to explore still lifes with a material called Polaroid. So she used this kind of Polaroid material in a large format view camera, which allowed her to see what the color was immediately after she made the picture. So she had this physical kind of result from her photograph. More intriguingly, she began to explore the difference between the way the world looked in still life imagery and how the world could be constrained to take on a new life inside of her own still life setup. So we have an artificial horizon line giving a sense of depth here because she is drawing it in. The illusion of perspective, or the illusion that there's something outside of the picture surface when really they don't exist beyond the picture surface. So photography is moving closer and closer to illusion in the 1980s, changing the strategy of how photography depicts truth. And before digital photography, here is Olivia Parker dealing with illusions in these intimate little still lifes that are about the thin line between life and death and things that are and things that are not in the world. So then in the painter's world, the 1980s brought David Salle, a painter who began to return painting back to figurative work. So rather than the idea of abstraction continuing on, Salle begins to look at pictures where accurate drawing becomes important again. If we look back to Olivia Parker, photography has captured the world of illusion. So painting begins to go back to the world of realism. The other interesting thing that happened in the 1980s was the beginning of something that has continued to this time, the kind of melding together of painting and photography. So here's Lucas Samaras, who's both a painter and a photographer, and he does both kinds of work. These pictures are made from Polaroid material, which has been manipulated by pressing into it with a stylus or allowing him to paint actually with the photographic emulsion, which gives it the illusion of painting. Here's Mexican photographer Pedro Mayer, and this is some of his work from the 1990s. He's still working today. So Mayer began to explore Mexican myth and legend and recreate many of these myths using digital technologies to make these magical kinds of images. Here's like a priest levitating in the air, a small boy floating across the sky over the city, and he's one of the first people using Adobe Photoshop to create artwork like this. Now I think it's much more commonplace, but at the time it was a pretty new kind of photography being made. So also interesting to note that Adobe Photoshop software is defined as a painting program, and a lot of the tools that you use in Photoshop are named after painting tools. Here's photographer Martino Lopez, who is another Mexican-American artist, taking images of her family and creating kind of a post-apocalyptic landscape with them. Here's Cindy Sherman again, who we've looked at before, making this image, which is part of a group of images that she called the History Portraits, and it's based on classic paintings. The portraits are modeled on images from long ago, in this case Caravaggio from the 1500s, yet she's doing it in a very different way. Here's Joel Peter Witkin creating a photographic new version of Botticelli's Birth of Venus with a hermaphrodite Venus, and we've talked a lot about Joel Peter Witkin, so you have a good sense of his subject matter. But this is certainly a strong reference to painting. Here's Botticelli's piece. In comparison. So what's happening in our contemporary times is that photography and painting have really come together. Scratch a great painting of our time now and we find a photograph. Scratch a great photograph and find a painting. Here's one of Joel Peter Witkin's still life images. And where does he come up with an image like this? From still life imagery from the past. So recalling still life paintings by Flemish masters, Witkin is using symbols to spark introspection in his work. The problem here is there's not just one thing that we can say. Photography comes into the world and changes the painter's world immeasurably and forever. Here are some contemporary photographic portraits made by Catherine Opie. Opie is using her influence from classic painting stylistically by applying formalities of these old master paintings to more modern subjects. And I'm going to include a link in the weekly module for you guys to look at that I think is really important to watch. So here is Paul Outerbridge, who was a photographer working in the early part of the 20th century, and I would say clearly he's inspired by the Cubist artists like Picasso to make photographic images that give the illusion of being made up of disparate parts. Even Edward Steichen in these advertising pictures is clearly lured by the Cubist intent. Also, another part of where photography is headed in the contemporary world is large-scale images. Picasso was making images that were very large-scale because photographs were small. Photographers now have the ability to make huge billboards like Suzanne Opton, or like this image from an installation in Times Square in New York City called Sleepwalker, where Douglas Aiken was able to get control of all of the large screens for a period of time and project a series of videos that were all related to one another called Sleepwalker. So this idea of scale, I think, is really a significant part of thinking about what photography can be in this time. Also remember that Steichen was a painter before he came to photography. And again, here he's portraying himself with photography with a painter's palette. This is a gum bichromate image. So the dilemma is that if we exist in our time today and we begin to look at the way photographs look and what photographs are being shown in galleries and museums and elevated to positions of relevance and importance and authority, what we're really seeing are photographers who are informed by this whole 170 plus year history of this push and pull of photography and painting. So recently I went to Chicago with a group of students and I saw an enormous amount of work where photography and painting and sculpture, etc., were all intermingled, mixed media artworks. So what we're seeing is an era where all of these things are coming together. And as we look at the ways in which these media have overlapped, we can think about ways in which photographs have changed the look and the feel of paintings and how paintings have also changed the way that photographs look and feel.